Welcome to our Wednesday webinar on today, May 19th. I'm reimagining the post-pandemic workforce, or workplace, I should say. I was actually thinking about last month when we were doing our post-pandemic workforce webinar, and this is very complementary to that webinar. So if you didn't see that one last month, you might want to check that one out because the two of them go very nicely together. My name is Linda Nelson. I'm the ICOR president, and I serve on several different U.S. tags, or U.S. The tag and as the ICOR liaison, and serve on several different committees that work on organizational resilience, as well as business continuity, crisis management, and others. And I am also the author of our Certified Organizational Resilience series of courses. Today, we're going to be looking specifically at the key issues involving the reopening of the workplace and what should be considered in a return to work plan. Like all of our other webinars, this recording will be available in the next day or two, and it'll be on our ICOR webinar page. If you have questions during the webinar, please post them in the questions button. I am alone today, so I will take a look at the questions at the end of the webinar. And just a reminder that you need to attend at least 35 minutes in order to attend or to receive your certificate of attendance. So, earlier or late last week in the United States, the CDC announced that we could go maskless if you were vaccinated. And this is really spurred on companies needing to consider what does that mean to return to the workplace, and what does that workplace look like? And so it's really timely. I never would have thought that when we put together our webinar series last October in 2020, that this actual webinar topic would be so relevant today. So this is just a couple things from the news, and this is saying my COVID scars need time to heal. Going maskless and getting back to normal is going to take me a while. And some of you may feel that way. Others of you may actually feel that this return to normal is somewhat unsettling, and maybe you're experiencing some kind of a post-COVID PTSD. Excuse me, I do want to qualify that in that it's really just in the United States where we have enough people vaccinated where we can start talking about not wearing masks. For most people in most countries in the world, that is not the reality. And therefore, I want you to, if you are not from the United States, I would like you to consider this webinar from the perspective of what you can expect once your country is more fully vaccinated and you can start returning to normal or getting back to your more social activities that you had previously. Because we do have people that are very excited to be able to, eat inside and hug people again and have some of those coronavirus restrictions ease. But I really want to be sensitive to the fact that that is not the way it is all over the world, and there are people very much suffering today, still in the United States, but especially in other countries like India and parts of Latin America and South America that have continued to struggle with the surge of the pandemic. So looking again a little more at this post-COVID PTSD time of thing, some of the things that I've seen quoted is, we've lived for over a year with such fear and such uncertainty. My body doesn't know what to do. My cues are all mixed up. Suddenly, what was forbidden in the past is supposed to be okay again. And the question is, how do you react? And some people are reacting with more fear and more anxiety because any sort of change impacts how you react. And so a lot of people have a lot of anxiety when there's change. Other people are able to embrace change. And that's a key aspect of uncertain times, is dealing with so much change. And what does that do to your emotional state? The actual definition of PTSD is a little bit, I think, narrower than what we're talking about here because we don't have an injury. So a condition of persistent mental or emotional stress occurring as a result of an injury. In this case, it could be as a result of an illness. The severe psychological shock in many cases for us has been something that's been more long term. So what is the impact of having, more than a year of being in your home and not being with people? And this, a lot of people have said that they have experienced sleep disturbance, having some anxiety even about going outside and being with people, and just kind of this dulled responses. And we're seeing that really a lot where, we saw in April and May and even into June, kind of people embracing the virtual world, for example, where now people are like, I can't get on, another webinar like this one more time. I'm just exhausted by the constant online presence. And so this is really, whether you want to formally say you have PTSD or just acknowledge the fact that this has been a really difficult time and you don't quite feel yourself, is something that companies really need to consider. And we're going to talk about that a lot today, which is how your organization should respond and prepare for managing people coming back to work. Because we do know that the general impact of having a worldwide pandemic is going to take a long time for us to reconcile. And also understanding that while we may be somewhat more free all of a sudden in the United States, the world is not free, and none of us can really be feeling, quote, much more normal until the entire world and every country and region has, either herd immunity or enough of the vaccination so that people can feel comfortable traveling again. So here is a quote from a physician. I'm a fully vaccinated physician, researcher, and scientist, but I'm also a human being who's afraid of this virus. And he says, you can talk all you want about going maskless and getting back to normal this summer. And I know what the science says, and I trust it, but you might have to give me a little bit more time to catch up with you. And so just acknowledging the fact that COVID-19 has presented us, don't forget not just the adults, but the children as well, with this kind of trauma that's been ongoing for more than a year. And some people compare it to things like shards of glass kind of burrowing under your skin, and we just can't seem to get it out. So when we start thinking about getting back to the office, it is essential to recognize that the workforce itself will need time to adapt to new ways of working in this post-pandemic era. So management teams really need to lead with empathy, and they need to demonstrate an understanding that while all of their employees have experienced this crisis, they haven't all experienced it in the same way. And that was part of what we talked about last month as well, is that, this has been a very uneven impact on people. And so you can't just pull out one kind of reopening plan that's going to work with everyone at your company. And so management really needs to make sure that employees understand what's being asked of them and what steps the company is taking to protect their health. So these are tasks that management's going to need to take. And just the reacclimating an on-site workforce is going to present an enormous change management challenge. So we've been managing change at a pace that has never happened before. And now now that we've kind of settled into one pace, now we're back to, okay, now we have to change again. And so you have to expect that you're going to need a communication strategy, that we're going to talk about overly communicating, because there are employees who have been in the workplace, and all of a sudden now there's going to be more of them. There's employees who've been working remotely, and now they're going to be returning. And there's going to be some that are going to continue to work remotely. And so what does that shared vision look like for what's coming next? One of the things to really remember also is that some people are sick of working from home. They want to get back to the office. But remember that the office that they left is not really going to be the same as the one that they're going to return to. So really, how is this pandemic sabbatical? What has that done to your feelings about the office? You might want to go back to your cubicle. You recall fondly, we always say these water cooler conversations, but just those casual interactions that you've had with people, or the ease of just having the way to print and not having to to, I can go and print something again. But we know that as long as COVID-19 remains a threat, and really even after most people are vaccinated, office life is going to be different, and we're going to have to acknowledge that and prepare for that. So I'd like to start with a poll and really get an idea of what your thoughts are about returning to the office. Maybe you're someone who's never left the office, and so you don't really have a lot of anxiety, but maybe you're also someone who's been working in the office, but all of a sudden there's going to be a lot more people working. Maybe you're really excited to get back to the office. Maybe you have some concerns about going back, or maybe you've decided, I do not want to go back at all. And one of the things we didn't say, we only had 5 choices for these polls, is that, you were working remotely before and you're not going back to the office. So I wasn't able to put that as an option. So please just pick the best one that you have. And we're going to close the poll in about 3 seconds. So 3, 2, 1, and go ahead and I will finish. So it's really interesting that 35% of you do not want to return. And actually, this is statistically almost exactly the same as what we found in our workforce study that we did last month. And we reported several different organizations that have been studying the pandemic. And it might even be a little lower than what a lot of people are saying. But there are 23% as well that have been working remotely and have some concerns. But I am happy to see that there are decent numbers of you that, have a little bit of anxiety, but perhaps aren't really feeling stress at all. So like almost 30% of you are not feeling any stress at all. So that is also something that companies really need to understand, is that where are your people today and how they feel about returning to the office. So before you just say, we expect you back in the office on Monday, there's a lot of work to be done by companies to understand their workforce. So I'm going to share some studies. This comes from SHRM, which is the Human Resource Organization, and this kind of gives you a checklist. I'm not going to go into detail on a lot of this because the details covered with other types of back to work types of things to consider, but obviously workplace safety, which actually maybe is a word that's now being used, or a term that's now being used totally differently. When we've talked about workplace safety in the past, it's usually about physical security. So here we're really talking about health, safety, in my opinion. So how do we manage the PPEs, the cleaning, determining who's vaccinated, how to manage physical distancing, what do your travel policies look like, and how are you going to manage customers and clients on site? How are you going to plan your recall procedures? So how, who, and when will employees return to work? How are you going to manage employees either unable or unwilling to return to work? So there's like 35% of you that might be fitting in that ballpark. And so how is work going to manage that? Also looking at your employee benefits. So things like paid leave and flexible spending might have changed. Also looking at your compensation policies, whether you've had hazard pay. One of the things that came out of last month's work was that a lot of people, I believe it was maybe even as many as 60% of the people surveyed by McKinsey, said that if they have to come back to work, that they expect a raise, because their costs of living are reduced when they don't have to travel to work. And therefore, they're getting much more out of their dollar, as I might say, for working, and they don't expect to have to go back and have a higher cost for work. And then you really need to decide, will you continue to have remote workers, and for how long? There's a lot of companies that, by the way, one of the things I really didn't talk about is that not every company, not every organization can do remote work. And so this isn't even relevant for them, and it isn't relevant for many countries. And we're going to talk a little bit about that too. But I'm assuming that the people who are on this webinar are people who have been working remotely, or at least have something to do with getting the workplace back up and going. And so it's relevant. Just remember, you need to over communicate on everything. Also consider that you should follow normal hiring procedures. when you're bringing back your laid off workers, if you have those. Look at all of your policies. We talked a minute ago about paid leave, but looking at attendance, your time off request procedures. What about flexible scheduling? Maybe now you've been able to work on irregular hours and still get your work done. What are you going to do for meal and rest breaks for the people at work? And what are your continued IT for remote work technology requirements? Also, if you're in the business continuity and crisis management space, I would certainly hope that you've been updating your plans and documenting all of that learning. And if you haven't added infectious disease control by now, I would say get on that. And if you're in the United States, in some states, unions are very powerful and important. So if you have a unionized workforce, you need to determine obligations to bargain about when you're implementing these changes. So don't forget that as well. PwC has a nice little PDF that they put together. It's literally a two-sided flyer, but they don't have a link for it because when you link on it, it goes to a PDF. So if you just go to the Reboot, Getting Back to the Workplace, and look for a PDF by PwC, it's a really nice little piece, and it might be something that's easily shared. So again, we're talking about managing health and safety, and they're saying you need to have some data. So you need to develop a plan to address and mitigate workplace illness. As many employees head back to the workplace, they are likely to encounter others who've continued to work on site as essential workers or those who have different distancing practices than they do. And so, this may concern returning workers. You should also look to have a phased-in return to workplace plan. It can be by job site or type of job, but make sure that you're using data and not dates. So making sure that your data is driving these decisions versus just saying, on June 7th, everybody's back. So also anticipate and plan for recurrences of stay-at-home measures. So all of a sudden, I'm speaking again from the United States where we don't really have the India variants. If all of a sudden the India variants are here, we may have to reinitiate some of those stay-at-home measures. And make sure that any of your risk measures that you execute and that your controls that you put in place are specific to COVID-19. So build a framework to manage and monitor your legal as well as your operational risks and procedures related to that return to the workplace. Make sure that you're also setting expectations for suppliers, vendors, and others who come in contact with your workers and facilities. Make sure that you develop a plan as well as a strategy and focus on your people, your productivity, and how you do your work. Make sure you lean into this. This is something that it's an opportunity. It's really an opportunity. And for years, ICOR has been teaching about making your workforce more agile and really looking at how your organization is structured. And we now have the opportunity, because everything's been tossed up in the air and there's been so many changes, for you to take what has been working really well and to use that as part of your problem solving and adding through your empowerment and trust to build on what has worked for you and put together a strategy and an action plan that puts people first. Again, using consistent data. PwC is really talking about data to help you make a decision-making approach, and while you're also looking at risks and controls. You're going to need to determine who needs to return to the workplace. As of April 22nd, nearly half of the companies say they're planning to make remote work a permanent option for roles that allow it. So, this is back to job function and job tasks. So make sure that your strategy addresses the needs of individuals, whether that's temporary or indefinite, both for on-site and remote. And make sure you have some kind of a playbook. This is going to be new for everybody, by the way. Most companies did not have that in place before. And so we always talk about, activating our plans, whether it's crisis management or business continuity or whatever the plans are. But we do spend very little time about how to, quote, return to normal. This has been a frustration. And if you've heard other webinars or taken a class from us, this is something that I say all the time. And even working on international standards, I have said, we just spent, 14 pages talking about how to activate and what you need to plan for, and we have 3 sentences on how to return to normal. There isn't a lot for us out there as examples of what to do. So this is a time where we need to document what we're doing, what we think we're going to do, what we actually do, and then put together some best practices for how to do that again. Because you need to look at all aspects of the plan, your workforce, your customers, what are your workplace needs, rethinking our health and safety, and then of course your company needs to have revenue, so you need to be productive. And so looking at how you can do some cost modeling with this workplace return as well. You're not going to hear the last of the importance of communicating. So you need to guide by your company's purpose, and you need to guide and lead with optimism and clarity. So go along on your purpose. Make sure that your decisions are really part of a really no regrets, so that you are making decisions that focus on the safety of your employees and your company's role in the community. You know, maybe if you're with a hospital or an emergency management piece or part of your government. And at that same time, this is a really good opportunity for you to inspire and teach managers new ways to lead. We cannot go back to the way we did it before. And so these times have really challenged leaders to think about how to engage and inspire their teams in this time of uncertainty and constant change. So let's elevate those success stories. Let's share them and use these success stories to document and make some really clear guidance and plans for how to continue with that. We do not want to lose those success stories. Just imagine finding something that really worked well, and now you're back at the workplace and they decide not to do it anymore. Think about how you would feel about that. So as a leader, we really need to consider how to make permanent some of these things that have worked for us. We also know that we have to continue to operate under change demands, and we have to continue to adapt because these conditions are going to continue to change. Um, and a really great way to do this is scenario building. So start looking at different scenarios to help you do your planning, whether it has to do with segmenting employees or sequencing your facility openings. And also really consider that while you're going through this change, you cannot expect your people to operate at 100% capacity. So this is a transition time. And so expect to have some production decreases. And PwC is suggesting that people might be working anywhere from 35 to 50% of their normal capacity during this transition time. We also need to accelerate digital remote ways of working. We need to really solidify how we're going to do that and what technologies have been working and where did you find gaps. So what kinds of technologies can you put in place to close those gaps? And then looking at some cost-effective ways to improve those core operations. Some of you found that you have in place things that were not easy to scale up or scale down quickly. So here, this may have been a bit of marketing by PwC to consider managed services, but it is one of the strategies or controls that you can put into place to help you be more agile. And then let's look at embracing and evolving those behaviors and new ways of working that make sense. We need to let go of how you've always done things. We need to quickly act and decisively adopt new strategies, tools, technologies, and ways of collaborating and communicating in the future. We also are going to need to totally rethink facilities and technology and consider, again, how and where people work. So we need to double down on automation and make things as digital as possible. It is time to remove manual processes that have stopped us from operating efficiently. We need to improve and replace those processes. So look at what you can do so that employees can be more productive and they're not stuck just doing things the old way. You're also going, if you haven't already, begun evaluating your real estate footprint. And here is where it's really tricky because there's so much uncertainty. And you might think, I don't ever want to go back to the workplace. I want to work remotely forever. And maybe you change your mind because your circumstances at home change. And so all of a sudden, if your company hasn't considered the fact that there might be changes in how people want to work in 6 months or a year, they might not have the real estate to accommodate you. And so the recommendation is that you look at your real estate footprint and you think about it out a year at least. because we do know that there's going to be reduced work site capacities. And so you may want to go to work one day and find there's not a seat for you. And an increased number of permanently remote positions as well. You're going to need to think about your training. As you make all of these changes, you're going to need to train your people. So what are your new safety measures? You're going to need to solidify those practices and incorporate virtual training so that those who are working remotely can also participate. And make sure that you're aware of the fact that there's going to be issues that arise, and really be prepared to address them. And you're going to need to make some investments. And so stay up to date on what's required and what your people need to stay productive. So people that are working remotely, one of the biggest concerns that people have had is they haven't had the internet connectivity that they've needed. They haven't had a printer if they needed a printer. There's been a lot of challenges that our remote workers have had over the last year, and not all of them have been resolved. Continue to be empathetic. That's how we started this webinar, and I wanted just to remind you of that. We need to, as leaders, be sensitive to the situations that your people are facing. So plan your work schedules with that people-first approach. Don't just look at physical distancing needs, but also the concerns of employees who all of a sudden have new responsibilities at home or may have health worries. You need to understand your workers' needs by enhancing employee listening. So, define and implement policies to account for employees' individual constraints and comfort levels, and including underlying health issues and childcare. You also are going to need to reevaluate your performance measures and look at what are your productivity blockers, and all the while looking again at employee concerns. So you're going to need to check in on employee preference analytics to better develop your workforce strategy. And one of the things that we talk about in our Agile Performance Management course is that, if you're doing annual evaluations only, it is really time to get off that drop and start doing ongoing evaluations of your people so that you can adapt to what needs and be able to react quickly. So when you're starting to look at how are you going to reevaluate and realign your business performance, and how that ties and connects to your individual performance, and that of course that ties to your compensation structures, this is also something that we're going to see changes in the upcoming year. And remember to continue to focus on the well-being of your people. Consider new or refreshed employee well-being programs to demonstrate caring. I mean, when you tell your people that you care about them, that's great. But when you show your people that you care about them, that is going to keep people working for you, because one of the statistics that's come out is that like 60% of people are looking to change jobs. And we know that what the cost is to companies when people leave. And so this is really an important time to demonstrate your caring. And this will help to reduce that emotional, physical, and mental stress that people are having. And understand what the top constraints are of your workforce. And you won't know that unless you talk to them. So, and you want them to be productive, and you want them to be effective. So, you need to be addressing what those are. And this is why I keep saying that, the workforce and the workplace are so intricately tied together that it's really hard sometimes to separate the two. And here's the big question. So if you're in the US today, I don't care what side you're on, but we see that in Congress, to mask or not to mask still remains a question. And so what are you going to do at your work? Should workers be required to wear a mask at work? So as of today, there is no guidance in the United States, and I don't know what it's like for every country in the world, but it's up to each company to decide, and you probably have to base that on local requirements. Because without local guidance, the organization ends up being the vaccination police, and I don't really know that anybody wants to be in that place. But that's both for its employees and its customers, and the more customer-facing you are, probably the more conservative you need to be, because we know that most workers in customer-facing jobs are going to still need to wear masks, and it's almost impossible to enforce separate workplace rules for the vaccinated and then unvaccinated, and the legality of even asking your people if they're vaccinated or not. There's a lot of, we're going to talk about legal issues in a minute, but there's a lot of gray areas that we have to figure out, and we have to figure it out quickly. So here comes the question. I have a little thing that we're going to look at in a second that sort of got me really thinking, but navigating the new space. So where did you used to sit? Where are you going to sit now? That's like a basic question. You might feel more comfortable working in an open part of the office, while others might feel safer sitting near their friends, people that they know are vaccinated, even perhaps. But there's a multitude of small decisions on top of learning to do old things in new ways. And this can be fatiguing. And that's part of the other reason why we're saying when people return to work, you have to expect a decrease in productivity. And people might get a little cranky with each other. And so, how are you going to manage um, sort of the work environment where the workers themselves might become cranky, even tied to whether or not you wear a mask or whether you're required to wear a mask? So you're going to need to manage that cognitive dissonance, and you're going to need to again continue to communicate on how that environment's changed and be very clear about your new policies. So this is kind of a fun little video, and it's with graphics.reuters.com, and it's called The Great Reboot. And it's an interactive thing that was developed by some workspace organizations to help people start thinking about how they should move around the office. So one of the things that you see is the arrows. One of the things that frustrates me the most is, and it's like when I'm at the grocery store or Walmart or any of those types of stores, is you see the arrows on the floor and nobody's following the arrows. And I'm like, boy, if people drove that way on one-way streets, there'd be a lot of accidents. And I know that back, even through the end of December, I was very reluctant to even go down an aisle, for example, if it was crowded with people coming towards me. Since I've been vaccinated, that reluctance has changed, but I still feel cautious. And so one of the things you might see in your office space are some arrows. And what you're also going to see is people working not right across from each other like they used to, but maybe working back to back from each other and being offset. But you do need to move around the office, and how do you do that? So let's just take a look at this site real quick because it's sort of interesting to see what it looks like. So give me 1 second I just wanted to make sure the audience view worked. So this is what the site looks like. And they give you a lot of information as well, but essentially there's this fun interactive tool. So I'm supposed to collect the stuff from my desk. Well, this is my desk over here. And I'm supposed to pick up supplies along the way. And while doing that, avoid close contact with my colleagues. So I'm going to give it a try. I have practiced this a few times, but I also want you to know it changes every time you do it. So here I am, and I'm thinking, okay, I want to move down here because I see less people. But all of a sudden, there's all these people popping up. And notice that I did actually crash into some things there. It's not easy what you can see here. And there's no arrows on the floor on this one, so I can't do that. But I'm going to pick up the stuff at my desk. However, I did actually walk over some people. So note, it says, now that you have your things, you can go find a place to be. So I'm going to go back out the way I went. And oops, I knocked into that as well. And I think I want to go work. I'm trying to find a place. It looks like all my places are taken. I finally found a place that I can work. So it's pretty funny. Last time I did this, they told me I had 8 close contacts and I was jumping over a lot of furniture. But this is just kind of a fun activity that you might want to do with your people as you're starting to think about what that planning looks like and how you do that planning. This is just another, they have another one of these, and I'm not going to take the time to do it here. But looking at the fact that people do need to have space to meet and what that meeting space looks like. And one of the things that they say here is that, you used to walk a straight line from point A to point B, and that might not be the way it is when you go back to work. And so in addition to changing some of those seat configurations, even to meet health department standards, you're going to need to consider not just 1- and 2-way lanes, but also looking from like, what are your set of rules for seating? I mentioned seating people back to back or kitty corner from each other, and chairs that should be faced away from traffic. one of the things I was talking about with my daughters, and she's had to stay at work this entire time, and her office or her little cubicle is right outside the lunchroom, and where people go to, communicate and relax, and all of that's remained open. And she says the number of people who stop by and sit in the corner of my desk and talk to me is considerable. And so looking at what some of those rules are for things. And so in addition, we need to start thinking about how do we control traffic flow? For example, when you're in meetings and everybody's leaving these meetings at the same time, and scheduling for the cleaning of the meeting rooms in between. And for some companies, they're going to have to put in new HVAC systems or improve or upgrade their HVAC systems to help just keeping the clean air approach. Especially, I just say in the United States, a lot of our offices, if you're working in the cities, the windows don't open. So, you can't just open the windows to have more circulation, or it might be too cold or too hot for that to be practical as well. So here is where I want to talk. I'm just mentioning here that this comes from a law firm and looking at some things that you should consider legally. So you should identify who's going to do the communicating with your employees, and that who can be many people, but you need to determine who those people are well before you expect people to be back in person. Again, several organizations have recommended putting together a survey to collect information from employees regarding their opinions about returning to in-person work. And then really make sure that you're considering talking points when you're doing that communicating about the impact of spreading COVID some more. What do we do if you're in a community where childcare have not come back online, where people live with or care for individuals who are high risk for COVID, and now you're expected to go back to work and bring that home with you? The same kind of answer with unvaccinated children. Now you're more exposed, and now you're with your kids who are not vaccinated yet. But they also state really clearly is not just to talk about the negatives, but also to emphasize the positive aspects of returning to work. Make sure that you are complying with any, in this case, they were saying executive orders and CDC and things, but whoever's in charge in your country or your local area, that you are meeting all of those laws for in-person operations and capacity limits. Make sure that you look at your state and local public health guidance as well. Make sure that you consult with your legal counsel regarding your legal and public health requirements, and make sure your company's return to work plan is approved by legal. That would probably be one of the important things you need to consider. And there are various work plans that should be considered. Traditional ones where the office is open, we've got safety protocols and social distancing measures in place, and everybody's coming back to work on the same day. You might decide to do incremental, and this is what I've heard a lot of companies talking about, even just talking with different friends and family members, saying that they know that they're going to be going back to work in September, or October, or June, and it really depends. They've already been informed of not the date, but the time frame for them, because they're doing an incremental return. And this depends on employees' willingness and desires, as well as their job tasks too. You might do a hybrid option where you stagger, where some employees are home indefinitely, but you work 2 to 3 days a week in the office, or you work every other week in the office, so you're home 5 days, in the office 5 days. There's all sorts of options that you can consider there. This is another reason why you need to talk to your people and ask them. And then you might want to start thinking about transitioning certain positions to being more permanent, while other positions are in office. So you have some people always working remotely, other people working always in the office. So looking at that piece as well. And then there are some companies that have decided that they're going to transition their entire workforce to working remotely on a permanent basis. It worked for them. There's companies like AT&T that did this for years, and I even think, can't remember if it was IBM or another large company that was entirely remote and then brought people back, and now they're having to consider, what do we do next? We've done both extremes. Maybe a hybrid option is our best answer. You also need to announce your return to work plan, and they're suggesting give at least 1 month's notice. You can't just spring this on people. They're going to need time to understand what that means for them. Make sure that you're informing them, of course, of all your safety precautions and protocols. Make sure you have instructions for returning company equipment that they may have been using. And if they're coming back to the office, you need to get your equipment back. These are some kind of weird things that you might not have thought of. Also, we talked about employee wellness. And so, really connecting people with your human resources, or if you've got EAP or anything else, if you're giving people someone to talk to that won't impact their job so they can express their concerns. Um, you also need to look at what are you going to do with furloughs or temporary leaves of absences. So who are you going to recall and when? Are you going to be terminating anybody that you've decided you can get along without? And I'd hate to be somebody in that position, but that is a reality that companies have operated for more than a year, and there might be positions that we found that we don't need anymore. And then what positions and salaries are recalled employees going to have? Make sure you document all of these decision making, because you need to make sure that if you recall or terminate employees, that you need to protect your company from potential discrimination claims, and make sure that your decision to recall employees is not based on apparent higher risk. So if you're only bringing back young and healthy people, not a good idea. If you are not bringing back, for example, pregnant employees, again, you're going to leave yourselves very vulnerable to legal action there. The other thing that's suggested, and this is actually the same suggestion that happens after any crisis or disaster, is they say when you reopen your workplace, whether it's because your building burned down or whatever it happens to be, that your management and senior level people should be there before you ask anybody else to return to work, and that they're there when employees return to work. Again, this is kind of dealing with these sensitive issues of higher risk people. Don't automatically prevent an employee that's considered higher risk from returning to work, because you could be then, they could be discriminated against because you're making the decision. So make sure that you don't do that unless the employee requests it. We talked about, again, about making sure that you have some kind of a procedure for bringing property back. And then you probably are going to have to look at what are consequences for employees that haven't returned property. And just remind employees of all of those things that may have not been pertinent while they were working from home. You're going to need to make sure they're very well informed. And again, you're going to need to train people, so don't forget about that. You also are going to need to continue hygiene and social distancing measures. So how can you adapt your workspace as much as practical? We showed you the little figures there, on how to do some of those things. But that also means that you're not, those figures, what we just looked at, and if you have people 6 feet apart from each other and you're in the same space as before, that means you can't have as many people there. So on some aspects, we're talking about needing a reduced amount of space because of people working remotely. And the other aspect is if people are required to have more space around them and to be able to move differently, we're going to need to set up our space differently as well. You may have to have more expenses for things, for cleaning, for example, that you haven't maybe had any expenses for cleaning in the past year or so, but now you have expenses for cleaning. You need to either provide, require, or permit employees to wear face coverings or masks. This is going to be a tricky one. You should continue to discourage handshaking and any other contacts, and continue to use non-contact methods of greetings. And allow employees to meet face-to-face in small one-on-one meetings as long as they're wearing their face coverings. Continue to discourage large group meetings in person, and maybe you continue to conduct those meetings via teleconference or web conference for the near future. You also need to make sure you look at personnel policies regarding COVID and vaccinations. So here's just some scenarios. You have an employee that's been exposed to COVID-19 and is asymptomatic. First thing you need to do is determine if the employee is fully vaccinated or a critical infrastructure worker. If the employee is not fully vaccinated or a critical infrastructure worker, you may instruct that employee to self-quarantine at home for 14 days. If the person is fully vaccinated and remains asymptomatic, they can continue to report to work, and they just need to monitor symptoms. If the employee is a critical infrastructure worker, here is where the company has the discretion, if business needs warrant or require, to follow that local guidance for workers that are asymptomatic, even though they've been exposed. So these are some really hard decisions that need to be documented, and you're going to need to follow through on them. Another thing your company might consider is a vaccination program. So I do know that a lot of companies are putting in vaccination programs, whether they're mandatory or voluntary. If you adopt one of these, just be aware that it is voluntary. And so for the most part, I have not heard of any company so far that has adopted a mandatory program, but we probably will hear that sometime in the future as vaccines become more available around the world. But this is, in the United States, at least, you have to accommodate religious and beliefs and disabilities. You also, if you're implementing a vaccination program, you need to pay for or provide paid leave in order to obtain or recover, and probably mostly from that second shot if you don't get the Johnson one. And if you're requesting proof of a vaccination, you only want to see that proof of vaccination. Like in the United States, we have a CDC vaccination card. Make sure that they do not share additional medical information. So some specific considerations when you have that hybrid and remote working. The first question is, will the company employ a remote-friendly and hybrid first model and develop a clear policy for employees? Some of this is a little bit repetitive, but consider which employees will be eligible. And make sure that you use that eligibility based on tenure, job function, and not something discriminatory. You need to consider the amount of time eligible employees will be required to be in person compared to remote. One of the things that people have noted is that, yes, their employees are very productive while they've been working remotely, but they've been working a lot more hours than they did when they were in person in order to get to to get their work done. They've had to put in more hours, so that's something also to consider. Make sure that your policy is very neutral and doesn't adversely impact any group of employees that's protected under local law. Again, make sure you communicate clearly with your employees and make sure that your written terms are also very consistent. Like we've talked about, you need to configure your office space consistent with your policy. So consider whether office real estate should be reconfigured to best support that flexible workforce. You may need to redesign your office space to optimize for individual workspaces, especially if you've got workspaces being used by multiple employees on varying schedules. And companies that have done this already, companies that have been doing this for years, are way ahead of companies that haven't been doing this. You need to make sure, again, you communicate those expectations, especially for communal and shared office spaces. And consider whether your upgrades to existing conferencing technology are going to be required, or maybe you need to actually, improve that. Maybe it wasn't sufficient for you. So some of the employment policies that you may need to consider is, what are your expense reimbursement policies? How do you keep time for non-exempt employees? Where are you going to have your rest periods and meal break policies? What about the protection of confidential information and data security? This has been a big issue with people working remotely. What are your internet security policies? Making sure that you're looking at your diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, as well as your complaint and grievance procedures and policies. You are also going to need, just like I started out saying, you cannot forget about your office culture. So make sure you have open channels of communication. Make sure that all employees have adequate and uniform access to performance feedback. Make sure your performance review criteria can be evenly applied, regardless of the face time. Make sure that you've got some kind of uniform system for documenting that key information between employees, regardless, again, of that physical location. And this is, again, kind of that water cooler conversations can be maintained. We do know that the things that people have missed the most are just those casual interactions with coworkers. And so how can you leverage technology solutions so that we don't lose that between the remote workers and the in-person workers? We do know that the hybrid office and flexibility may not be as flexible as maybe what you hope for. It's very probable that companies say they're going to do it, but the actual implementing of it may not be equal to your expectations. And so it is more complex than what we think. And so this may take a little bit of time as well. So this is another great experiment. You know, how do we get people back from their homes, teams back together, at least some of the time? And so leadership has to start planning for personnel coming in 2 to 3 days a week, at least for right now. And so it's a really big opportunity for us to embrace workplace change. And we do know that hybrid work is at kind of that center ground, and at least in the short term, if not for the long term. You should have some kind of a staged approach. I would imagine that, well, depending on where you are in the world, you know, if you're in countries that are being majorly impacted, you're still in stage 2 probably, and you might not even be leaving your home for any reasons. In the US, we're seeing that soft open happening right now, level 4 or stage 4, and we're going to be moving to 5 and 6, I would think, during the next 6 months, and the rest of 2021. This is something that was put out by Bloomberg just a couple of days ago. It's worth looking into. It's quite lengthy, but I just wanted to give you an example of how you can analyze whether you should work from home or work in the office, and what sorts of activities might best be done at home or might best be done in the office. And so the blue is pertaining to home and the black is pertaining to office. I'm not going to go through any of these things. I just want to give you an example of what you might do to try to get some of that information. And you're probably going to need to get this information from your people. Here they did a survey, but you only really care about your people and what they are most comfortable with. So while you might rely on surveys done by others on other people, I would strongly encourage you to survey your people. And again, as you get to, learning from others, having space to work on projects and having that informal social interaction, we know that office is better for a lot of those things. Also, I think we need to be really sensitive to the fact that if you want to work from home, that some of the expectations of you are going to change. There's been a lot of blurring of family and home life that have been tolerated. Everybody has a story. The internet's full of videos about, you know, things happening while people are working, and that's not going to be tolerated once this is becoming more formal. So you are going to be expected to ensure that you've got adequate childcare, that you've got a space that's quiet and uninterrupted. You don't have people walking around in the background, any of those things. You're going to be expected, if you're going to work from home, that you have a place that you are able to do that. So also consider that companies need to really think through the side effects of imposing a top-down, one-size-fits-all employment policy. I think that time is over. And look at the fact that your working patterns are probably tied to your employment contract. So there may even need to be some employment contracts renegotiated when people return to work. So again, there's a lot of change happening here that we need to be sensitive to. Also, there are concerns about the focus on role-based guidelines. Will actually allow employers to kind of say, hey, we've got hybrid working policies in place, while they're actually just paying lip service, and that those wider issues of flexibility aren't being accounted for. If you're working remotely and the expectation is that if you're working in person, you work 8:30 to 4:30. If you're working remotely, you work 8:30 to 4:30. But for the past year, you've been working from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. and then you come back and you work from 11 to 2, and then you're back at work kind of 9 o'clock to midnight. You're putting in different hours. If those are conversations that people need to have and that companies need to understand, because we know that this is really the first time that there's really very few companies bragging that they've got this totally figured out. And this next phase, again, is going to be even murkier. It's a lot easier to activate than it is to kind of return and put things into place. And there's a lot of complexity. So one of the quotes here is that I can envision situations where organizations have something in mind that might not be the normal pattern of working in the office every day, and their people say, you can't change that without my consent. So having this communication and really helping your people to be part of those decision making is very, very important. So while we know that companies need to ensure that business goals are met, they also need to make sure that their premises are COVID secure, a whole different idea again with security, and that all of your people are treated fairly. This is just a picture. There was a study done about the future of work after COVID by McKinsey that's, I don't know, 100 and some pages long that you might find really interesting to take a look at. And it was tied to some work also been done by the US Department of Labor. And what they were doing is looking at occupations and how they relate to physical proximity. So medical care and personal care has the most physical, you have to have the most interaction and the closeness to it, where things like transportation of goods and outdoor production and maintenance has the lowest scores. However, most of us are falling into this category of computer-based office work. And so, it's a little bit higher than 50%, 68% there, where we have human interaction. And that 68% of human interaction is the part that needs to be considered when you're developing your new workplace policies. We also see workplace trends that may reshape work. Remote and virtual meetings are likely to continue, but we don't think they're going to be at the same pace. And so we think that people will enjoy webinars again, and that people will be, seeing online as a positive versus just something that exhausts them because it's been overdone. And this is tied again, 20 to 25% of the workforces in advanced economies could work from home between 3 and 5 days a week. This is not equal. One of the things that even in the United States, it's not equal. One of the things we're talking about is infrastructure and what is the access to high-speed internet. And, in a lot of economies, you've got a lot of people living in a small apartment, and that's the norm. That's the way it is. And so trying to work from home is virtually impossible to be successful and productive. We also know that this 20 to 25% is 4 to 5 times more than remote work than it was before the pandemic. And so if that actually happens, what we're going to see is a large change in the geography of work. As we see both individuals and companies shifting out of large cities and moving into the suburbs and small cities. I know where I live, houses are for sale for maybe a day or two. As long as they're reasonably priced, people from the city are moving out and away from the city because they don't need to live in the city anymore to avoid the commute. So we also need to make sure that you're shifting to flexible workspaces, and so that we are seeing that we probably are going to have the overall space be less. In a study done by McKinsey in August, they said that companies are saying that they're going to reduce their office space by 30%. And this is going to then impact restaurants and retail and all those things that come around the workplace itself. It should also put a dent in business travel because now we have seen the advent and acceptance of virtual meetings and other aspects of work. They think that leisure travel and tourism will rebound, but also they think about 20% of business travel is going to go away, which is going to impact our airline and travel industry as well. But on the other side, e-commerce and other virtual transactions are booming. So there's offsets. So while commercial aerospace and airports and hospitality and food service might be negatively impacted, there are other aspects of the economy that are booming. So I just want to close with our last poll, because we know that 97% of companies are planning for hybrid working of some kind. 36% plan to redesign jobs. So just a reminder, the worst thing you can do is to close your eyes, cover your ears, and imagine you can try to go back to the way it was before. If you do that, you are going to go backwards. So I'm only going to take 30 seconds for this because I know we are running out of time. So give me 1 second to launch the second poll. So the question is, where is your organization on hybrid work? A lot of companies already had hybrid work practices. Some other companies are taking action right now to redesign. Some people are thinking about it, and there are other that haven't even started thinking about it yet. And again, this is really pertaining to offices. Doesn't really pertain to a lot of other the rest of the workforce. So I'm going to give you about 2 more seconds. All right, so really interesting. Kind of what I thought is that most companies are starting to take action and redesign, which we have at 42%. But I'm also really comforted to see that 33% of you have already had this in place before. And those of you that have already had this in place before are going to be the most successful. The other 12%, about 24% of you, so about, a fourth of the audience here, their companies haven't really gotten started thinking about it yet. And that certainly can be tied to the fact that, depending on where you are in the world, that it isn't even relevant for you. Just to learn more, there's a lot of really great resources here. When we send out your certificate, we will also send out these links so that you can go ahead and study some more about them. I invite you back June 16th. We're going to be talking about resilience as a strategy. And we have a guest speaker on June 23rd, Intertech, and they are a certification body, and they're going to be talking about information security in the work from home era. Thank you for joining us. Read our blogs, join our networks, follow us, and I will take a look at the questions. We did just run out of time. I will take a look at the questions and answer those after the webinar today. Thank you very much. Hope to see you in June.